The Chinese have started to out-innovate in their weapons, and the net result is America and the West is not prepared for the challenge it faces.
It feels a lot like, who's the cheapest place to manufacture? Are we going to do that again with AI?
In warfare is our true human nature of who we are, what we are, how we do it, why we do it.
So who are the folks that are war-blind, linear, and hubristic?
Okay, so
Welcome to the MacroMashup podcast. I'm your host, Neil Winwood. This podcast is sponsored by Dakota Ridge Capital, your energy investments partner, helping developers partner with family offices, banks, corporations to make smart, clean energy deals and maximize government tax incentives.
MacroMashup.
Welcome everybody to the inaugural episode of MacroMashup. And today I have with me a very special guest indeed, David Murrin, who began his intellectual journey at Exeter studying geophysics and then jumped into seismology, which I looked it up to get a little bit more of a precise definition, but it's a study of the Earth's internal structure to understand the dynamics and the causes. He has a side interest in sailing and naval history. So without further ado, let's say hi to David. Thank you for joining us. Really appreciate you being my first guest.
a real honor. Thank you very much.
Sure. Let's jump into what I think is the thing that blew my mind when I listened to your podcast with the eminence Grease Grant Williams, which is World War III. Apparently we're in it, and that's alarming. So why don't you unpack that a little bit for us?
Well, the conclusion that I came to was a product of two life threads. One is from the earliest age, the study of warfare. In warfare is our true human nature of who we are, what we are, how we do it, why we do it, and actually, I would now argue in my latest book, the driver to human evolution through lateralization. And it struck me, as you pointed out, there were real similarities between the structure in effect of Papua New Guinean tribes, which are part of seismology because they're our workforce, and the trading floor of JP Morgan. And the commonality was we are humans that I would argue are not individuals, but have collective human behavioral patterns. And the result of that process is essentially we become predictable when we sublimate ourselves to the collective. And so I started to study markets and this behavioral pattern. I did not subscribe to the cause and effect dynamics that economists and many traders believe in, which is the idea that news predicts price. I think actually you're looking at something much more fundamental in the processing and behavioral patterns of markets. Dots of information come out in the economy. And one of the cycles which I picked up a long time ago was the Kondratiev cycle. And he was a Russian economist, and he identified these big 54-year peaks in history where inflation and therefore bonds increased in prices. But there was also then a counter surge from 2010 to 2020, and we're now in the next third wave, which is a super surge into a 2030 high. And I feared that the moment I found the bottom of that cycle, that World War III would break out in 2022, because the wars always break out before the peaks, because the friction coefficient becomes so great it triggers that action. So that was a bit of a sobering moment to think I had children in this world and that, somewhere in 2022 onwards, World War III would start. And that was 20 years ago that I understood the power of that cycle. And of course, I did a huge amount of study and work. And I'm afraid the more I studied it, the more I was convinced it was going to happen. The other part of it was understanding how commodity economies work. And Russia is a commodity economy that in the Cold War was at the peak of the Kondratiev cycle in 75. And if you go back and look at the history books, in the capitalist world, we wondered whether we could ever beat communism because their economy seemed stronger. We were fraught with inflation and debt, and everything was out of control as a consumer society. And yet all it was a manifestation of a cycle, a commodity cycle with two sides of the coin, the producer making lots of money from higher prices and the consumer that was suffering from subsequent inflation through that process. And that affected the way that whole systems were facing off with each other and they were preparing for war. So in answer to the question, the cycle always was from 2022 onwards, roughly 8 years before the 2030 peak, we would risk having a war. And that war would spread like a disease. So when the invasion of Ukraine happened, and again, I was able to predict it about 6 months out using the commodity cycle dynamics and the psychology of Putin and the lack of understanding of Biden that it was going to happen. And I will argue that is a full-on regional war by proxy between Russia and NATO nations that somehow or another we think is like Afghanistan was in the Cold War. It isn't. I mean, at the moment, Putin has a shadow war against Europe. He's tried to nobble all the cables in Europe. It's open warfare in any other terms. It's just we live with denying politicians who do not want to face the reality.
Well, I have a quote from you. I think it's from you. It's a war-blind, linear, and hubristic mindset. I think that's...
I like that because I did actually come up with that. that.
You definitely came up with that. I definitely read
Well
that.
researched.
And so, some people you think understand what's going on, some of the geopolitical players, and some don't. So who are the folks that are war blind, linear, and hubristic? And who are the ones that actually get it?
So the people that get it are the people that have been aggressive towards the Western world. The Iranians, the North Koreans, the Chinese at the epicenter of it, and the Russians. The problem in our society is that the empire cycles, which I created in before breaking the code of history, systems rise. There's a duality with humanity. And I would argue that the hunter-gatherers were always lateral to survive. And then when agrarianism came on, it became a much more linear thought process of repetition and cycles and predictability. And we are designed to be symbiotic, but of course, being human, we just don't think like that. And so all systems that are built and expand are dominated by lateral thought. What happens is systems rise with predominant lateralization, and they build an empire. And then as the thing stabilizes and becomes more predictable, of course, linear people become more effective because there's less blindsided responses are needed. The system becomes institutionalized and it rolls over the top. And by the time it reaches decline, it's ejected every lateral thinker because they're inconvenient. They don't think like everyone else. So we face at the moment a problem in the West in that we're at the bottom of the cycle with America. And so why are we blind? We're blind because America, the last of the Western Christian empires, in terminal decline and super linearized, as epitomized by Biden with all the disasters he brought. Then we've done two other things. We've started to print money, and we've been doing it for 20 years, or America has, leading the charge. And money printing is dangerous. And I want you to think about this completely differently from the way the textbooks tell you. If you think about these social systems, which are like Gaussian curves and empires, their fundamental reason to be is to generate what I call anti-entropy, to push back the entropy of the universe by social coherence and make us safer and more secure and less susceptible to random events like storms that wipe out your grain supplies or whatever else, because you're so big, you're diversified. And when the system stops being anti-entropic, it starts to contract because of linear thinking. It's less adaptable. But what you do is compensate is if you're a business or a country, you just leverage. So if you're used to 4% real growth and you've dropped to 2%, the simple solution is I'll just double up my leverage and I'll borrow some money. And now I look like I've got 4%, real returns. But in fact, you've only got 2% and the other 2% comes from the leverage. And that process started in 03 after 9/11. And it continued. I'd say it was 3 times leverage in 03, 8 times leverage in 08, 40 times leverage by where we are now. Unbelievably leveraged, which means that whatever number you choose, 2, 3, 4% for American growth, I would argue that only 1/40th of it is real unleveraged growth.
How do you unpack that, David? How do you get at, in terms of the visibility of statistics, the underlying leverage that you're talking about?
It's so difficult. And so if you ask an economist, this question will stymie any economist I've met. Please, could you tell me the real unleveraged growth in America? So what this leverage does is it means that someone that actually is presiding over a failing system just increases financialization and looks like they're being successful and they're not adapting. So it locks in lack of adaptation. And then suddenly a big event comes along and everyone's swept to one side. So you've got linearization, you've got the process of money printing, which then re-emphasizes linearization of decline. And then you've got the other effect that when the stock market's at the high, cortisol, it isn't available because everyone's full of dopamine, because look how clever they are. Mm-hmm. And the net effect is a completely blind society that's hubristic and in denial. So that side of it's similar, but the degree of it is huge. I think it's an order bigger. And the net result is America and the West is not prepared for the challenge it faces.
So does this end with something exogenous or endogenous? And if it's exogenous, is that China or Russia? Or what?
Let's think of the world as one internal system. And the internal system has a cycle whereby the Western world contracts in its anti-entropy and the other system that challenges it rises, and the drumbeat of conflict is this essentially entropic pulse that comes through the contractive cycle. I call it a war wave. It triggers a conflict, and then all that matters is your adaptation level and your industrialization level. And I would argue that right now, or very quickly actually, the Ukrainian forces after the invasion didn't have many linear commanders, because linear commanders very quickly lose their commands and the lives of their people. So Ukraine is a fully lateralized adaptive war machine right now. And even Russia, which is a super linearized communist system, is showing signs of adaptation as the conflict goes on and learning how to be better to survive. And you can just see that between the survivability of even these poor Russian soldiers. But compared to the North Koreans, who just literally don't have a clue, they survive far better, or relatively better. So lateralization and war go hand in hand. The longer the process, the more lateralization. But there is a difficulty and there's a penalty.
One of the challenges, I think, to understanding asking who are the protagonists in this Third World War that we're entering is, in a demographic and an economic sense, China is not thriving, right? They have a lot of problems. And so people might find it somewhat strange to think that they're actually going to lead the charge as a major threat in this next process. I know you have some thoughts on that and what is compelling China to act the way it is.
Okay, so we've definitely highlighted that America is the last of the Western Christian empires in a 500-year super Christian system that started with the Catholic faiths and then ended up with the Protestant maritime faiths to create global maritime hegemony that went from the Dutch to the British to the Americans and is now up for grabs with the challenge. On the other side of the equation, you've got the Chinese. And you're absolutely right. If you look at their empire curve, this one that started in the Boxer Revolution, the first phase was up until the end of their civil war. And what people forget is they then went to war with everyone for the next 25 years. That everyone in their neighbor. And what stopped them from expanding further? America got control of the USSR in the Cold War. It came off the peak in 75 and it started to create barriers that prevented expansion. So this empire called China was relatively in its own system ready to go elbows out, but it was constrained by the American glass ceiling. And it tried one more time in 96 in the third Taiwan Straits crisis. And it was met with 2 carrier groups and a MEU, and it went, oh, that's not going to work. We won't be doing any overt challenging for a while. So what the Chinese did was really quite unique in history. They migrated their overt challenge to a covert challenge. And they seduced the West to bring its manufacturing base to China, where inflation was low, to keep inflation low in a part of the cycle that actually I think would have increased and saw much greater inflation from 2000 to 2010, which also then allowed money printing to function. But their deal was to get us to invest in the biggest industrial base in the world, strip us of our IP, and then use that industrial base as a war machine to outproduce us and beat a physical war. So that's exactly what they've been preparing for. And they are in the point of an empire where if they don't go now, they're never going. So they've got a debt structure which looks to the Western eye like our structure. But I've uncovered that all empires have 2 debt mounds. The first mound is an expansion where they borrow to build their USPs. If they're successful, they become an empire, a monopoly, and they repay it all. Britain did it, America did it. And the second debt mound that America has is actually just lack of productivity and compensation that we've talked about through linearization, which actually leads nowhere because there is no innovation and new USPs that are competitive. It just leads to a lot of debt and being a standing target. So I would argue that they're 2 different forms of debt and different forms of mindset. And there will be a point where China out-innovates us. And that's exactly where it is. It is cleaning our clocks because the weapon systems they're producing aren't even on our schedule. And that scares me because they've built the greatest industrial base. And now they're proving that they are really out-innovating us and faster with weapon systems that we can't compete with. And they've got the industrial base to then build them faster than we have. So they, in their last chance saloon, they are setting themselves up to go to war. And at the moment, we are going to really, really suffer. So yes, they're in last chance saloon, but they've used their time to make that last chance look like a very, very dangerous challenge.
I mean, I think the point that you make about outsourcing our manufacturing base, we're potentially seeing another version of that with AI, because I think DeepSeek is producing, in the unit that they measure, which is, I think, about 700,000 words, it's the cost of that for them is like 1.4 cents. Meta is currently charging $2.80 for that. So if you're looking to source your AI capability, where would you rather go? It feels a lot like who's the cheapest place to manufacture? And are we going to do that again with AI?
Well, we can't. I wouldn't touch that thing. It's embedded with a Trojan horse. It just is the fastest way to strip all your IP that you connect to it. Yeah. So yes, it looks cheaper, but how it got to be cheaper, whether it's subsidized, I think the whole thing is very dangerous.
That's the question. I mean, my wife said to me the other day, she said, yeah, fine, but don't you think that the Chinese have subsidized this? How do we know how much it's costing? And I said, I've written about this a little bit in the newsletter. It's like, well, why would you put this on your phone? They tell you up front that they're going to collect all of the keystrokes, all of the prompts. They're going to store them on servers in China. And we know that the CCP can access that at a moment's notice, and they're required to provide it. So it seems to me crazy that you would actually download and use DeepSeek with anything other than expectation you're going to be ripped off and shattered.
Well, you saw many service branches in the States just said you can't use it on your phone. And they're quite right. It should be this is when the West needs a coherent strategy to say, sorry, can't use it, not allowed here, because it is a Trojan horse without doubt. All it continues is it's a beautiful, sophisticated piece of bait for someone that, thinks money is the ultimate arbiter and gives their freedom away for relatively small amounts. Yeah. And that's what we really face. We fail to see what really China is, which if you just look at the Uyghurs and you look at Hong Kong, tells us everything. It is a system that literally uses through social engineering the greatest control mechanism. They have two means, and this is part of their vision. They have the ability to outbuild American warships at about 140 to 200 to 1. That's terrifying, because that's how Britain became a global maritime power. We could build more ships than the French. That's how America became a global maritime power in the Second World War. They could build more ships than anyone. Actually, Britain built almost as many ships with Canada, but nonetheless, they're the biggest shipbuilding yards. And now the Chinese have it in spades. So we are on that course. The Chinese have started to out-innovate in their weapons, and the alarm bells come from a number of areas. One is the dynamics of great power competition, and at the moment we seem to be losing to technology that's pretty unbelievable, like underwater sonars and hypersonic weapons we haven't even got in our inventory. And the other piece is it looks like we are moving towards disclosure. In fact, we've already had disclosure, but the disclosure is going to become publicly recognized. And what does it do to our society to realize we're not alone anymore? And that is an investment issue as much as a human issue.
So let's move it on to that, because I'm sure we've scared all the listeners now with the prospects of World War III and what China represents and Russia and so forth. But how does that impact, or should it impact, the way that we think about investing? And what is the investment world equivalent of a basement stocked with, canned goods and weapons of self-protection?
So I'm fascinated by every layer of our human experience. And right now we're in one of those states where the steady state of an environment that we'd all like to, in linear thinking, see continuation of is at the point of total change. And that total change destroys wealth like 1929 in the most brutal way. And you either understand what's coming and you're out, or you're stuck and you don't get out. So I think after some 17 years of a bull money printing market, the game's over. So having seen this process start off in 21, then my arguments were as follows. You don't want to be long of bonds because it's in a massive bear market. You don't really want to be long of equities, but they could go up because of money printing. So choose equities that you like gold, silver, things that have leverage, and still take advantage of some money printing, but it reverses, they'll still go up. And also cryptos, which I saw as an alternative safe haven in a period when the dollar was going to be eroded, but only for a certain period of time before the blockchain was broken. So it's not a substitute for gold, as most people think. Well, how does that crunch come about? I would say starting a trade war probably fits the bill. And the problem that Trump hasn't worked out, as most Americans haven't worked out, when they drive around in Kentucky in the middle of nowhere, why are they so wealthy? They're wealthy because they created a sophisticated form of empire, which dollarized a footprint, used a powerful military to protect the footprint, and then took money from everyone in it through dollarization back into the core, which allowed the economy to function. When you reduce the size of the footprint, you're in trouble. When you reduce the size of the footprint and you're a mature old system with very few small margins, you're really in trouble. And what is a trade war? It's the reduction of globalization, the reduction of that footprint at a time when you've only got marginal returns keeping it alive. It's suicide. And I think that's what Trump has committed. So this idea that the Gilded Age is coming, I'm afraid, doesn't work. And the idea that this will be painful, but we'll come out of it, it doesn't work either in any form of dynamics when I study empires at this stage. It would have been far better if he created tax incentives for industrialization and the key strategic businesses he needed than to do this.
Right. I mean, I've listened to a few podcasts recently about Bitcoin versus gold. There's a fellow out there called Peter Schiff who is fairly vocal about his disparagement of the whole crypto sphere. And both of them are analyzed to some degree as a counter to the money printing, the debasement of the currency. Do you see a fundamental difference between the reasons for investing in Bitcoin and the reasons for investing in gold?
Let's look at the two. Gold has always been, in a period of inflation and dislocation, it's been the great safe haven, and nothing has changed. I think the story of crypto is very much the story of a currency substitute in a period of sequentially long-term dollar decline. And one of the things that people seem to forget is we live in the world of quantum computers, and blockchain is an analog system of creating a chain of value. And I think a quantum computer will split blockchain apart. So I think somewhere on this line, and it's never at the top, it's on the way down after a major high, we will have a blockchain nightmare somewhere. So no, it's not the same. It's completely different. And right now, I say that as someone that's captured, all the twists and turns of Bitcoin, because I view it as the perfect trading psychology. There's no one big player, relatively. It's full of, dare I say, an awful lot of unconscious participants who now think they're trading gods but are not self-aware of how patterns operate, and they produce beautiful trading patterns. It's probably one of my most favorite traded items, and for the past 5 years it has been an alpha generator, whether it's picking the high and being short or the bottom and being high, in ways that is just like a fruit machine that never stops giving. Right. And And right now, I think the condition is blind bullishness on an epic scale, and all of that bullishness will be wiped out by the time this bubble completes popping, which leaves gold on a completely different basis.
Right. I mean, it is fascinating to think about the different frame of reference that generations younger than ours have toward investing versus speculating. And I've definitely heard arguments made that the attraction of the Bitcoin phenomenon has been largely a product of the erosion of trust in the traditional institutions, the gamification of investing through platforms such as, Robinhood, and the rise of meme coins, which have totally detached from the fundamental concepts of investing to purely number go up. As long as it's going up, let's sort of participate in that cycle. So I definitely hear that. How should people prepare themselves for this? I mean, you could go into a protective crouch and think about this and be frozen and not know what to do. So, I mean, I think part of your mission is to inform people, right, of what's going on, to try and get them beyond that denial phase. What's your recommendation as to how people should protect themselves?
Well, I mean, the first thing is this point that you've raised is if you're in denial, you are vulnerable because you will be blindsided. So the fear of actually waking up and taking the red pill in matrix terms and seeing the world for how it really is, not how you'd like it to be, is the first step. Mm-hmm. So once you start to realize the world is about to change, well, there's always an adaptive strategy because most people are going to be caught in the downdraft, which leaves huge opportunities if you see elsewhere. Right. So just because a construct that we're used to is about to change and it feels like the destruction, forest fires feel pretty destructive, but what comes up afterwards is a lovely, vital, forest. It's part of the cycle of life. And I think making the decision to be either burnt in the forest fire, happily deluded, or understanding forest fires periodically come away, and then you're going to actually buy forest land when it's been burnt because it's no one else will, but it's going to grow back. Those sort of opportunities you should be thinking about.
Right. Well, it would be nice if we had some truly visionary leaders to help us with that process. We may be a little bit short of those. And I think just to react to your confession of dyslexia and your ability to write, you write an enormous amount. I mean, I know that only because I read a small portion of it and know that it's a small portion, and that's an enormous amount to read. So I think it would be worth for you to spend 5 minutes telling people where they can find the work that you put out there, the different offerings that you have, where people can, subscribe, participate, and benefit from the learning that you have to impart.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think the reason why I write is I'm an enthusiast about life, and I see so much around us that has hidden patterns and structure that is something we have to understand, and I'm driven by that. And it's a little bit sort of like being sick in a strange way. And I only write about things that I really think make sense. And I tend to, as you know, look at the detail that builds a whole picture that then, has a reality to it. So yes, I'm very lateral, but I also have a linear discipline to justify what lateral things should be followed. And they're written in my marinations. And you can come and register on the website and you can listen to podcasts that are linked because many podcasts are free. So if you register, you'll see those podcasts when they come up. But I really advise you to go up to Marinations Gold. The weekly was designed to give people a taste, but the Marinations Gold is to give a full geopolitical update as to what is coming down the track. Well, it's not like a newspaper that's telling you what is happening now. It's like, as you know, it's a construct that tells you what will happen and why it's going to happen.
You're not afraid to make predictions and be held accountable to tracking how your predictions turned out. I mean, you report on that frequently.
Yes, I'm a scientist, so I believe that, and I'm also a principal investor. So I'm not a researcher. What I'm doing is a CIO that used to invest money on for a hedge fund, my hedge fund, with investors' money, and I'm sharing what I do with accountability. What will surprise people is how scarily accurate a lot of my work is. Mm-hmm. And I provide that track record, as you say, for people to judge, because then it helps them make better decisions. And also, when I'm wrong, I learn. So one of the times I was wrong, I thought that Trump wouldn't get in the second term further out in the year. But I also made a decision to myself that if he wasn't 3%, if Harris wasn't 3% ahead, and by the way, if there's any kind of major global conflict within 2 weeks of the election, it would favor Trump as a strong person in an entropic world. And of course, on the Friday before the election, none of those conditions were met, and I wrote a switch. And the switch was actually, I now have to say Trump will win because of these conditions. But I paused. And it's the only time I can remember pausing. And I paused because there's another problem with Trump. He's highly narcissistic. In fact, he's beyond narcissism. He has a messiah's complex. And from my own experience in the study of history, any system led by someone like that always ends with a disastrous outcome. And so that was the end of democracy as we know it. I would argue that he will preside over that. There's a question of whether the American people chose democracy or they chose an attempt at adaptation, because he's very very lateral. And in the end, I let my emotion overcome my logic. And I was wrong that time, the first time in 20 years. But I delighted in explaining my thought process and where I went wrong, because it's important to do that.
Yeah, I think it's a good friend of mine who has this notion that when you're observing things which are troubling, you have to be aware that you should rather watch the movie than be in the movie. And yet it's a challenge, because if you see things that are going on in the movie that are very distressing and can actually impact you, on a daily basis, it's hard not to. And to some degree, as your son has done, at some point you do have to get into the movie.
You do. And what's interesting is I think on the whole, I'm pretty good at that, observing from above and seeing these patterns. But personally, there is one thing I really dislike is narcissism, because I've encountered it in my life and it's always been destructive. And so Trump does press one of my narcissistic, really, I know what he is buttons. And I think that personally colored my outcome. And I'm honest about that, because we have to be. But your friend's advice is really true. Being objective, you can't make the world as you'd like it to be. It is how it is. You just have to study its behavioral patterns. So Marination's Gold will take all of you up and explain to you why I think something, as well as what I think is happening, and give you supporting evidence around it. And there are there are pieces about this UAP congressional hearing that'll take you from don't know anything to, oh my goodness, this is a real issue.
I can tell everybody who's listening and watching on YouTube that the site is excellent. The Marinations are very insightful. They don't just focus on investment. They do go into quite some detail on the history of war, the principles of war, the dynamics of war, what's going on in the various European governments. You wrote a very interesting segment on the infighting between the SAS, the Special Air Services, and the Special Boat Services, and how much of a disservice that was doing to the British Armed Forces. So they are very broad. I mean, you have been described as something of a polymath, so it's hard to know where you should go in terms of listening to or reading the work of a polymath, because it's so at times overwhelming, and there's a lot of it. But I do recommend it, and I recommend the CIO product also. And I see it in the same way as I see an athletic coach or a strength coach. You have to do the work yourself ultimately, right? That coach cannot lift the weights for you, cannot commit to the effort required to maintain your fitness, but you nevertheless do need a coach in order that you don't get hurt, in order that you have a clue about what you're doing. And I think all of those things that you can benefit from when you check into, maybe you could just repeat the site so that people have it. And I'll link.
It's www.davidmurrin.co.uk, or your global forecaster. They'll both go to the same location.
Right.
And once you're on it, there's a lot of information about my theories you can look at. Although the next book coming out called Breaking the Code of War is really like the evolution of those theories to the next level. And I'm really excited to describe, not only do my theories include how we self-organize to build empires and nations, but I now can explain why we do it. And once you explain why you do it, you get a whole new level of understanding and that interface between using war to evolve. And that's what we do.
Well, David, I'm so happy that you agreed to come on this podcast. I know there are going to be many more, and there's so much to talk about. I'm sure you'll come back on at some point. But for today, thank you very much, and we'll be in touch.
Well, thank you, Neil, for the privilege of being your first podcast guest. It's been just great fun and great questions.
Great.
Thank you very much. And everyone, I really think you should go and read Neil's book. It's fantastic if you're a parent. Give it to your kids for their birthday and Christmas. I loved it.
Thank you, David. Bye-bye.
MacroMashup.